the Parliament of the Isle of Man is 1,000 years old, and it comprises two branches. We have the two legislative branches, the House of Keys, 24 members elected by the public over 16 years of age, and we have the Legislative Council, which is the President, the Attorney General, the Lord Bishop, and 8 other members elected by the Keys. These two branches sit weekly to consider primary legislation. But once a month, they sit jointly in Tynwald Court to consider secondary legislation, finance, and policy matters. So this was the situation up until March, when the COVID crisis emerged in the Isle of Man. And in mid-March, at the regular monthly sitting of Tynwald, it was announced by on behalf of the Lieutenant Governor that a state of emergency had been proclaimed, which gave the government power to introduce orders that were necessary, controlling movement, public gatherings, and all the rest of it. It was also announced that government primary legislative business would be suspended for a period of 2 months. Now, what this meant was that Tynwald, which would have normally sat a month later, was going to have to consider meeting much more regularly, because the emergency orders introduced by government, had, under the Emergency Powers Act, had effect for 7 days, unless they were approved by Tynwald to be extended. So we found ourselves very quickly in the position of having to convene Tynwald again to pass this emergency secondary legislation. And we had 2 sittings within the space of a week, operated under social distancing conditions, with members spread out into the public gallery at a separated 2 meters as far as possible. But it was found very quickly that this wasn't satisfactory, because there was a certain amount of moving around the chamber in order to use the voting buttons, plus a number of members were increasingly self-isolating. So what to do? The staff of Tynwald were tasked with bringing in a system of virtual sittings of Tynwald, operated remotely, electronically, on iPads, and we'll come on to how that came about shortly. But when that was successfully introduced, having been trialed, we were able to go on to a systematic weekly sitting of Tynwald, so that we were able to capture with confidence all the emergency orders that were being brought out on a virtual daily basis to enable them to continue. So Tynwald was able to carry on the business of scrutinizing and underpinning the necessary emergency legislation, and we've been doing so ever since. And indeed, the branches themselves, while suspended from their normal weekly sittings, were able, under this virtual technology, to hold 2 sittings of their own to process the various readings of some necessary primary legislation in relation to the COVID crisis as well. And that's the position we remain in. The virtual solution and how it was brought in. I think at this stage, if I hand over to Mr. Speaker, he'll be able to go through some of the detail of what was done initially and subsequently.
Thank you, Mr. President. Certainly, in considering this, we looked at 5 prerequisites for a virtual sitting. Firstly, it was about making sure that there was no legal or constitutional barrier to sitting. Secondly, about a willingness and ability of the members to make it happen, to make sure that no members were disenfranchised by creating a virtual solution. We're also very fortunate that here in the Isle of Man, we have excellent broadband coverage. So members were already on broadband, and as Mr. President said, already used to using iPads and the like to be able to communicate. We're also a very small parliament, as the President has outlined, so we have manageable numbers in order to achieve an entirely virtual solution rather than the hybrid solution that the UK has gone with. And finally, of course, we've got a fantastic team who made this happen. And we've done this using Microsoft Teams, and we've still broadcast this live through our live link and also out on the radio. Sometimes the setup looks a bit Heath Robinson, but actually it does tend to work. It's not about what it looks like, it's what it does. That's the important thing. In terms of the restrictions, we have found that we are at the mercy of the slowest broadband connection though. And that has meant that we've had to dispense with the visual element, which makes Teams and Zoom so useful. And that's a real setback compared to the chamber, because you miss out, for example, on the body language, which is so important when you're in the parliamentary chamber. And I think that would be the same anywhere in the Commonwealth. It also means that the effects of humour are diminished as well, because you just don't get that live feedback. You can't see what people's reactions are. And it's also meant that we've had a very different approach to voting, and that's had to be done in the chat box. And that's not quite as optimal as we would normally have, where we can just all vote at the same time using the buttons in the chamber. The procedure is very much the same. We've tried to keep it as close as possible to existing standing orders. And members have found this really positive. They've all engaged. There's been very few on the whole technical problems. Each sitting has been able to go ahead from start to finish without it being suspended for the technology. I think the lessons that we would say we've learned are that things take longer, things are a bit slower. It's not as good in terms of feedback. We do try and counteract the tech problems by having a test 10-20 minutes beforehand, make sure that everyone's dialed in. But we've been able to do this with sittings of the House, and from start to finish of 2 bills now. We've been able to do virtual scrutiny, and the Public Accounts Committee has taken evidence through video link as well. And as I said, the pinnacle being the weekly sittings of Tynwald Court, which have been able to be entirely dealt with electronically for the currency of the emergency.
Thanks for that, and thank you both, Mr. President, Mr. Speaker. I should introduce myself. My name is John Davies, and I'm Chief Executive of CPA UK. And thank you to you both, and also Joe Corkish, one of your clerks who we have on the line, for joining us. If I may, a few sort of questions about that. Whoever wants to take them, really. It's been impressive. Joanne, if I may, just first, you were saying that from what you said, people have found it easier to adapt than you might have expected.
Well, I think we've had a lot of the prerequisites there so that people can take it on. So people are already used to getting their papers on iPads anyway. A lot of the members already use things such as Telegram and groups like that for the chatter in the chamber, rather than passing physical notes around the chamber. So I think people are already pretty technically adept. I say, given the environment on the Isle of Man as well, I think that's it has been pretty well received, and no one has been dialed out, which is the important thing. We were seeing fewer members coming into the chamber because they were self-isolating. This way, actually, we've improved participation in the parliamentary process.
That's great. And I don't know whether this is one for Joe, perhaps, from the clerk's point of view, but I think Joe mentioned that that you kept the standing orders as close as possible to previous, but that implies there have been some changes. Is that right? You've had to make some change to standing orders?
We haven't amended the standing orders substantively, but what we do is at the beginning of each sitting, standing orders are suspended to allow the sitting to be taken virtually.
Okay, and has that been, I assume that's been broadly accepted by the members?
Yes, definitely. No challenge to that.
I think, Mr. President, we've talked about continuity being a very strong part, though, of the virtual sitting, so that there's as few changes as possible. I think the President might want to elaborate on that.
Yes, I mean, we, for example, sit formally, Mr. Speaker, as Deputy President, and myself, socially distanced with the two clerks. We announce the convening of the sitting in the presence of the Sword of State. We invite, as normal, the proceedings to start with the Lord Bishop leading us in prayer, and we stick to the agenda and the formality of speaking. So in other words, our standing orders provide for members to speak only once when called upon to do so. Instead of catching the speaker or the president's eye as normal, they indicate a willingness or an intention to speak by signing into the chat box that they wish to speak. The presiding officer then, instead of writing down a list of those who have caught his eye, goes through the list systematically, although it's at the presiding officer's discretion in the order, but it's normally in the order that members wish to speak. So that formality of debate is still maintained. Members don't see each other, so you don't have the impact has tended to be less cut and thrust. There's still the ability to intervene, asking a member to give way, but they need to do this by putting intervention in the chat box and break up the flow of the debate that way. It's tended to mean shorter contributions. There are fewer flights of oratory because, of course, there's no live audience and there's no live reaction going on that can be seen. So contributions have tended to be shorter, more businesslike and to the point. And it's been possible to get through quite a large amount of business virtually quite efficiently that way.
That seems a very happy mix of continuity and perhaps some welcome innovation and concision and brevity from members. So that sounds like a rather good thing to hear. I think one of you mentioned that that you've been obviously communicating this to the public and that it's still available to the public to see your proceedings. What's the reaction been like from the public?
Well, they of course they can't see the proceedings. They can hear the proceedings. Manx Radio routinely broadcast Tynwald anyway, and they have been doing that. But we also, on our Tynwald website, of course, have live audio streaming. And the reaction has been very positive. One or two members of the public have got in touch with me just to ask about some fairly practical things. What happens if a member goes offline? Can they still vote? Well, of course, the fallback position is if we see if anybody's gone offline, they're still within email contacts, and contact can be theoretically established that way, but it's not been a problem so far. When it comes to voting, of course, traditionally people were voting with voting buttons, and the result was secret until the voting was completed, and then the tally of votes was flashed up on a screen. In this instance, voting, of course, is by voting yes or no in the chat box button. So as all the votes come in, one can see how everyone else is voting, but the process is so quick that there's no room for shenanigans necessarily or tactical voting. It's a bit like the old system we had of before electronic voting was brought in 15 years ago. It was a called vote, in fact.
Yeah, so it's interesting those different experiences across Commonwealth parliaments, how there are as many different voting systems as there are parliaments almost, and how they are faring in these times has been interesting. If I may, we've heard from the presiding officers' points of view. If I might come to Joe Corkish now, from imagine for you and Clerk colleagues there, some new challenges as to how you're helping manage the business.
Yes, I mean, it all happened very quickly. We went from the social distancing in the chamber, which lasted for about a week, and then we moved into the virtual sittings. I think the way we were able to achieve that was we just built on what we already had. So we already had the technology in place to stream via our website and for Manx Radio to broadcast sittings. So that's why we established the base in one of our chambers, so we still had access to that connectivity. And then we picked Microsoft Teams because that was the software that members were provided with through their government systems. And so we used that to set up the actual meetings and the sittings. So we tested that on a Thursday afternoon, and then on the Friday we had a sitting of Tynwald and a sitting of both branches on the same day. That was a very long day. What we've found from the clerk's point of view is that we do need 2 clerks at each sitting, where normally for the branches we would only have 1. And so we have what we call the procedural clerk, who is doing what you would imagine a clerk would normally do, drafting amendments and dealing with matters of procedure. And then we have our Teams clerk, who is managing the console. And the clerks usually swap around during the sitting, because managing the console and keeping an eye on the microphones and so on, it's not particularly difficult, but you can't afford to drift. You have to really concentrate. So we do some swapping around there. I think we've adapted as we've gone along. So, for example, we were talking about the voting, and we discovered that actually silently counting the votes wasn't very interesting for our audience, and they all thought we'd disappeared. So we actually just started reading out the vote whilst doing the count, and that meant that people were reassured that the connection hadn't dropped and we were all still there. So really, it's not very much different to doing a normal sitting. It's just that we can't see the people that we're sitting with.
Thanks, Joe. And it's interesting you should say that you're having to basically double up for clerks in those two functions. We've heard from other parliaments. I think the Canadian Parliament, I was hearing experience from there yesterday, where actually I think for their committee sessions they're finding instead of 1 clerk for a committee they're needing 3. So quite a labour-intensive process potentially, I think. And you did mention committee. Sorry, yes, over to you, please.
I was just going to say, for committees, we are actually managing with 1 clerk, because the committee sessions tend to be much more driven by the chair and the committee members, and there's not necessarily the need for procedural advice. The other thing I should just mention that we have done is normally at a sitting we would have a member of our Hansard team. But we've actually managed to move the Hansard team remotely, and so the clerk or one of the member of staff will actually switch on the recording and that kind of thing for the Hansard team, and then they do what they normally do remotely, because they would normally tweet during the sittings and that kind of thing, and they can do that from wherever they are. So that's worked quite well for us as well.
Thanks, Joe. It's and I know your Hansard team has got some experience with that in any case, haven't they? Because I think they provide remote Hansard services for some other colleagues around our region, indeed, of the CPA. But I was interested. I think, John, you were saying something about the Public Accounts Committee having met. Is anything you'd like to sort of say further about that?
Yeah, there was a bit of a growing frustration that government was exercising all these emergency powers, and they were coming to Tynwald in quite large numbers. There were a lot of actions being taken, a lot of executive power being exercised. And for the first 4 weeks, apart from questions to the Chief Minister's statement, there wasn't an awful lot of systematic scrutiny. So, for example, there was a big issue around residents who are people who live on the Isle of Man who are returning to the Isle of Man. And the medical advice was around the quarantine system. And obviously that all had to be worked up really quickly. There was a feeling that it was not just sort of done quickly, but some things have been left behind in the process. So there were a lot of people who wanted questions asking about how that had been justified, what the treatment of those people were, and these sorts of questions. So the PAC sort of took a lead from the plethora of scrutiny committees, sort of acted as a mixture of sort of liaison committee, PAC, and stood in the place of some of the other committees. And we did this with the acceptance of the other committees as well, that this was for this emergency period. And we took, within a week, again, took the committee from a standing start to taking evidence and producing a report on this particular issue. And we're going to follow that up with weekly PAC hearings and reports so that we can provide that timely scrutiny and that constructive input and make sure that scrutiny is still happening effectively and in a timely manner. And I think that's provided the public with an awful lot of reassurance about Parliament really doing its job.
Yeah, and I can see the President nodding as well. I might come back into that overall question of scrutiny in a second, but just on the committees, so that evidence was being, I assume, must have been being taken by video or telephone or something similar. Is that something you've done before as well?
Yeah, I mean, Tynwald, as ever, is quite innovative, but I think 10 years ago, I was the first chairman of a Tynwald Select Committee to take evidence on a video link. And so this is something that really, it isn't new and it has been done a bit before, but I think everyone being in a video link, even the committee not being in the same room, it has meant that we've had to be a lot more coordinated. There's been an awful lot more preparation than there would ordinarily be for a committee meeting, a little bit more sort of stage management perhaps also, to make sure that everyone knows what we're trying to get out of it. And we're very focused. We only have 1 hour for this session. So we really do have to put a lot of prep into it. And there's a huge amount of effort that goes into it by the clerks and the iterative cycles that have to happen in order to make sure that everyone is on the same page when we start at 11 o'clock on Friday.
Thanks, Joanne. That's you've all three given us a very rich picture so far of elements of how Tynwald has reacted, and it's very impressive, I have to say. But I wonder if any of you, but perhaps starting with Mr. President, if you look at it overall, how do you feel Tynwald is being able to discharge its functions around scrutiny and indeed legislation as a whole at the moment?
Yes, in normal times, of course, it is the role of Parliament to give democratic oversight to the executive and to hold them into account. That is the role of any Parliament. That's what it's there for. In times of emergency, of course, it's no different. The speed of executive decisions is of necessity very great. They're having to make decisions on a daily basis, and it's important that the public have confidence that those decisions are being made in the best interests of the public. The public invests a great deal of trust in its leaders in times of crisis and emergency to do the right thing, but it's important that Parliament demonstrates that it can adapt its own perhaps more leisurely and longer systems of scrutiny to the emergency situation. So, as Mr. Speaker has described, the focus of scrutiny in the case of the Isle of Man has been concentrated in the Public Accounts Committee, which of course has in its membership the chairs of all the other standing scrutiny committees over other departmental areas. So that's a very useful vehicle on a weekly systematic basis to hold to account the executive for the decisions that they're making on a continual basis.
I think one of the things that members have really missed during this time is the ability to stick their head around other people's doors and just say, how's it going? What about this? I've heard about that. To catch up on what we in the Isle of Man would call the skeet, the news and the happenings of what's going on. And with the everything happening by video link or telephone, communications are harder. Everything does take longer. And that has led to, I think, frustration, and that is exacerbated by the fast pace of decision making that has to happen. But that's where these important continuity is important, and also the visibility of scrutiny becomes so important in fast moving situations to overcome these difficulties.
Absolutely right. And I'm conscious we're drawing relatively short on time, but if you had any thoughts, any review really, on either things you think which you've had to do quickly but Tynwald will keep, or pieces of advice for others as they're facing this challenge?
Well, I think members in other parliaments shouldn't be afraid of adapting. Nowadays, there's all sorts of technology available. They should test out what suits them best. When we are relatively small numbers, it's fairly manageable with 40 people involved at any one time. Other parliaments who are much smaller might well have the ability to connect visually as well as audibly without losing connections on screens. Much bigger parliaments, of course, there are greater opportunities for technical things to go wrong in terms of links and so on. So the advice would be do what suits you best, but go with it with confidence. Ensure the public know what are going on, and they can see that their representatives are doing the same job on their behalf that they used to do.
I can't see virtual Tynwald being the medium that we'll all be using in the future, no matter how good the technology gets. It's just not as good as being able to eyeball your colleagues in the chamber. But I do think that visible scrutiny is a lesson that we would take out of this and pass on to others. People do look to government for leadership in a crisis, as the President said, but I think people also then look to Parliament to ask the questions that they want asking at difficult times as well. And that's absolutely critical. That's been our role, and I think that in the Isle of Man context, that's worked quite well.
I think also I can't see a time when you could say this technology will replace live physical sittings. It's very important, particularly in a parliament which is composed of independent members, where there are not party lines to be followed and a certain amount of predictability on a vote. It's very important that members are able, through the force of argument in debate, actually to sway an audience, which you can only do if you're there physically and people are reacting and visibly changing their opinion in line with the argument. I mean, that pure debating has been lost perhaps over the years in many parliaments. But nonetheless, I think when one considers the amount of time people physically have to devote to turning up at meetings, I think with meetings, committee meetings with much smaller numbers, I think going forward there's a real opportunity to consider whether they could be done as efficiently online, virtually, having put one's toe in the water, if you like, with this technology. It may become more routine for committee meetings where there's smaller numbers involved.
Thank you, finally, Joe, I think you had a last point.
Yeah, I think on a practical note, I would say strongly use what you already have. There's a lot of free stuff out there as well, which we've taken advantage of. Setting up our virtual solutions cost us almost nothing, only some time. But also, look, we certainly have been in touch with colleagues in other jurisdictions as well. So we've had a couple of meetings over the last few weeks with colleagues in the Channel Islands parliaments, and all discussed the various solutions. They're all different because our parliaments are all different, but working with them, we've been able to pick up some ideas and tips from each other, and that's why things like working with CPA UK and doing things like this is really valuable, because those contacts are there, and we're more than happy to offer any support or advice that we can to any other jurisdictions.
Joe, thank you, and indeed thank you all. And that's in some ways a great note to draw this session to a close, because CPA, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, as you said, Joe, is all about networking and sharing with others who, as Mr. President, indeed you've all said, are conducting this crucial parliamentary role of scrutinising government, of holding the executive to account, of supporting the government at times like this where it's appropriate. And also making sure that the people can see and understand that scrutiny is happening. If I may, the Isle of Man has set a great example of that. You've moved quickly, as you say. You've got yourselves to a place very quickly that there's enabling you to do that, from what I can see. Thank you for sharing that. I think that collaboration is key. We will keep from the UK Parliament learning from you and helping, I hope, share around not just our region of the British Isles and Mediterranean, but also more broadly across CPA, some of the lessons you've kindly shared with us today about using what you've got. I'm very much struck by Mr. President's remarks about the courage needed, about giving it a go. I think that's absolutely right. And Joanne's words about actually, adapting existing structures, giving the committees the chance to provide that scrutiny role, build on what they do, and showing the public that these institutions have a really critical role at these times and others. But thank you very much, all of you, and we look very much forward to staying in touch in these difficult times, and thanks for your time.